You're listening in on an animated discussion about Superman the Animated Series with two experts in their fields. I'm Joshua Unruh, superhero scholar.
And I'm Caleb Masters, your friendly neighborhood film critic extraordinaire from thecinematropolis.com. And today's topic is the Prometheon. Went to the top of Olympus and stole fire from the gods, and all of a sudden Superman's fighting a Greek god type. That's a wrong episode. My bad. I thought
that'll be down the road a piece. There'll be some Justice League episodes for that, I think.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, good. I'm sorry I got confused there. I will say, when I saw the title, I was like, oh, we're gonna get into the weird Greek tie-ins that we sometimes see with the DCAU. But nope. This is just a straight up. If anything, I would say he's. What would you say? A Titan more than anything.
Yes, absolutely. That is more on point from the mythological aspect. I think, in fact, I know for a fact, there's no way it can't be this, that the way we get to the name of this is the commitment that this creative team has to introducing more and more Jack Kirby stuff into Superman the Animated Series. Because while I think that this design is really basic, but very good because it does right by, kaiju in general, but more to the point, when you are first introduced to the Prometheon and he is all but crucified on an asteroid, this image can evoke nothing but the giants of the Promethean galaxy who are trapped in the source wall during Kirby's Fourth World books. Now, that was a lot, and I'm going to stop to see if any of that makes any sense to you.
Joshua, I'm so glad you have an explanation for this. I bona fide am, because I was like, this is a character we never hear about again, even though he's frozen in a lake. I didn't recognize him, but the way he was, in a crucifix type shape up to the meteor, I was like, they got this from somewhere, surely.
Yes.
So please do continue enlighten me. I'm so happy to hear it's another Jack Kirby pull, because I always love me some more Jack Kirby.
It's a little bit of an oblique Kirby pull because it's not exactly the thing that he does, but it's also so clearly based on what he was doing. So, according to the mythology of the Fourth World books, which include New Gods, Mr. Miracle, The Forever People, and Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen. According to the mythology of those books, the source, capital S, is where all of the New Gods' power comes from. And as you can imagine, now we're going to talk so much more about the New Gods when we get to the episodes of Superman that introduce it. But as you can imagine, it's mythological. So there is a purely good force and a purely evil force. Darkseid is the purely evil force, and he wants to penetrate the source wall, which is the actual literal physical barrier that exists between the universe of the New Gods, which is not necessarily the same universe as the mainstream DCU. We'll get to it. And the source is part of the multiverse, whatever that means. Whatever the source is or lives or does, it's on the other side of this wall. And Darkseid wants to penetrate the wall, and Highfather, the leader of New Genesis, wants to protect and cultivate the source. The reason that Darkseid doesn't just go hard for the wall, well, I mean, he does, but the reason he doesn't do it straight on is because the wall itself is made mostly from the giants of the Promethean galaxy. These are literally titanic, godlike beings who fired themselves at the source wall on the backs of comets in an effort to destroy the wall or breach it and become one with the source. They were punished for this hubris by being essentially petrified and turned into part of the wall. So I've given you a link, Caleb, if you would like to click it, and I will put this picture in the show notes as well, so you can all see what Kirby's source wall looked like and the Promethean figures that are essentially crucified onto it, and there is no way that's not what the Promethean is doing. Would you agree?
Joshua, I'm just looking at this image, and this is kind of terrifying. This image is very striking. Laser, and several of them have lasers coming out of their eyes, firing what I assume is the wall. Wow. Woo. Okay, this is good stuff. I appreciate you sharing this. So again, listeners, I do encourage you to check the show notes to see this image, because what you're seeing is just a myriad of these giant titans stacked on walls, I guess, to hold still. And also, it makes the name make quite a bit more sense, because obviously this is the Prometheon being a reference to Prometheus, the one who stole fire from the gods, right? And I do believe the image that we often closely associate with is he's up the top of Mount Olympus with that same sort of crucified style stance.
Yes, that's right. According to the mythology, Prometheus gives fire to human beings against Zeus's wishes, and Zeus punishes him by chaining him to the side of the mountain and an eagle eating his liver every day. But because Prometheus is an immortal, he does not die, and his liver regrows, and the eagle starts over the next day. That is his existence forever. And it was the theft of fire and giving it to human beings that caused that punishment for Prometheus. Similarly, the Promethean giants wanted to steal the fire of the source wall for themselves, and now they are punished by being linked to the wall. The imagery is not subtle. Like, Kirby is not a subtle man, but he knows what he's doing with reworks of mythology, I think.
I think it's a very, very clever use of Greek mythology. And I know we do a lot of that, especially in DC, but even some in Marvel as well. And this is, I would say, one of the more striking images I've seen from a Kirby comic in recent memory. So thank you for sharing that. Now, Joshua, we've talked a lot about the actual titular Promethean, but there is one other character we probably should acknowledge, and I think it really gets to what I find most interesting in this episode, and that is General Hardcastle. What did you think of this design? And maybe we can talk a little bit more about what he may mean for the future of Superman.
So most of what we get in his design is in an astronaut suit, right? So we don't really know what the usual everyday General Hardcastle look is going to be. But the thing that we get very plainly from this episode is that he's supposed to be a real, like, John Wayne style of general. We got his big square jaw, this big block head. He's got a lot more swagger than he really does intelligence or compassion. And there is some of that in the visual. I mentioned the lantern jaw, the very, like a jarhead, marine haircut and head shape. But we get most of that from the voice acting, I think, and they kill it. They absolutely kill it. This is exactly the general we wanted here, trying to sound cool while he talks nonsense about Superman being untrustworthy.
Right, and just as a quick note for listeners, the voice actor is Charles Napier, and yeah, I'd say he does a very good job, sort of putting that, like, this is what you would consider maybe. I like that you bring the John Wayne comparison in, because it feels very like rugged American general who's not taking none of your BS and likes to make smug comments. And hey, he doesn't trust Superman just because he's an alien. So you're going back to a little bit of, you could say, xenophobia a bit. He says, I don't like what I can't trust, and he can't trust Superman, which he has no reason not to trust Superman. He has just decided, because he is an outsider and because he does not, quote unquote, have any allegiances, that he is not trustworthy. And we see him take some pretty rash actions throughout the episode because he does not care about Superman. Firstly, he blows the asteroid up against the recommendation of Dr. Hamilton, and Dr. Hamilton's like, yeah, Superman's out there, you're gonna blow him up, and he's like, I don't really care. And not only does he like hurt Superman, sort of, but yeah, he's the one, his rash thinking, his rash reaction is what unleashes the Promethean on planet Earth. So this is hashtag very on brand for 2020, I would say. But
it is depressingly on brand for 2020 to watch people in charge disregard expertise in favor of leading with apparently decisive action rooted in ignorance. I mean, it's just sad that this episode that's 25 years old can still speak so specifically to our moment. But here we are.
Here we are. But you know what follows, Joshua, is, we get what I would consider a very good kaiju Superman v Superman story, or Godzilla, if you will, I think is another one that comes to mind. Obviously, Godzilla being probably the most famous kaiju. But this is some good old-fashioned Superman versus giant monster action. And I gotta say, it was a real treat.
I agree completely. I am so impressed with this episode. taking not one, but two sort of extinction level events and pitting Superman against them. I mean, we start with the giant asteroid, but then quickly transition into the Prometheon. And it's two very dangerous global events that are related. So the storytelling makes sense, but they're also just so different from one another. We really get completely different Superman approaches to them. I'm so impressed with this episode. I kind of can't get over it, honestly.
Well, and also I'm glad, I guess we didn't even take a moment, to distinguish the initial global event was the asteroid. And I got to say, Joshua, I straight up forgot there was a giant monster that was underneath the asteroid. So it's actually, and I would say it's not super long, but I'd say it goes on for like 3 to 4 minutes before you actually find out, right? So it is a little bit of a plot twist, and you're like, what? And then all of a sudden, a million questions. What is that? What are they going to do about it? And of course, yes, then we turn into giant kaiju paddle. And I think in a lot of ways it's structured like a little mini kaiju story, the way the military is involved, the way that they're trying to use science to figure out how to find its weakness. They, because they're able to interpret the alien message from the creators of the Promethean creature, machine, whatever. They're able to determine that it absorbs heat. So they're like, well, how do we keep it from absorbing heat so that it runs out of power? Well, we just freeze it. And I thought it was a pretty nice little touch.
I agree. And it also feels very much like the original approaches to Godzilla, where the military is at least as much of a problem as it is a help, and we're going to lean very heavily on science to deal with the problem. They're definitely wearing their influences on their sleeve, but reimagining them into this Superman lens that I'm just going to say it. This is in a race for best Superman the Animated Series episode for me right now. And the reason I say, well, I mean, I'm prepared to hear a bunch of pushback, but I have some pretty good reasons. I feel like this thing is moody, right? Like it's real sort of a slow burn, and there's multiple like character conflicts going on behind the scenes as Superman deals with the actual problem. They take their time explaining the nature of the problem. Like I actually would have been fine if the binary warning was only, this thing is incredibly dangerous, don't let it get hot. Like, I wish we didn't have the rest of the backstory, if I'm honest, because I loved how long they let us wait to find anything out, Oh,
I'd say I'd agree with you there. I think it would have been much more impactful and almost kind of ominous if we never found out where it came from. I'll be honest.
Right.
I think that's kind of a neat twist, because I don't really feel like the origin story actually added any real value to what was happening. It didn't really, other than that they found out that it absorbs heat for energy, but they didn't need a backstory to learn that. They could have just as easily read the message that says, warning, absorbs heat or something like that. I actually think the one thing I would have done differently, and similar to kaiju, a lot of kaiju movies, by the way, is just not reveal where it comes from. So it's sort of a hanging mystery, and you're also like, oh my gosh, are there going to be more of them that show up?
That is, I think, one of the best parts of kaiju as horror film as well as disaster film, is that if you don't know where the giant monster came from, if you don't understand its origins, you have to worry about it returning, and you also have to worry about there being other ones. And because we get the backstory here, that's not hanging over us, which turns out to be good because we don't really see the Promethean again. So, it's a little bit, plus some, minus some others. But I still, even if they have to tell us, I love how long they make us wait. And I really want to zero in on how good the Superman feats are in this episode. And I want to contrast that with blasts from the past and see what you think. So Superman is largely ineffectual in this episode. I don't mean that in a negative way. He is up against something that he cannot stop. He can really only just slow it down.
He's a man on a mission. He's a man on a mission. He has one goal, and it's to stop the thing. Right?
Right. And it's simple. A thing he can't just stop. Like, a lot of times the Superman answer is, I'll just punch it harder or lift the heavier thing or whatever. And in this case, that's not an option. When he punches it full in the face, it staggers, but it does not stop and just seems to get more angry. And why I want to compare this to blasts from the past is that if you look at these spectacles of Superman's powers in this episode, they're not really that spectacular, right? The spectacle is better in blasts from the past. But the stakes don't feel like they're there in Blasts from the Past. Whereas here, the stakes are right there in your face and largely insurmountable until the last minute. This is wonderful storytelling as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, especially if you're comparing this to Blast from the Past. You and I were pretty lukewarm on it. And I think a big part of that was supposed to be the draw was the spectacle. It just felt sort of hollow, though. Here, like you said, I genuinely believe a whole city might get wiped out before Superman can stop it. And I feel for those people. And again, I don't know if it's the way they utilize sort of that kaiju storytelling, or if it's just the way that Superman sort of conveys his exhaustion and concern and uncertainty. But I am with you. I think that this is certainly a better spectacle type story of Superman the Animated Series, far better than anything we've seen before, especially Blast from the Past.
Okay, there's one other aspect of this episode that I really want to zero in on, and I don't know that I personally have like big thoughts on this topic, but it's something you and I have been discussing through Superman the Animated Series especially, but I mean, I think it's going to become a thing we can't avoid in New Batman Adventures either, and that is in 2020, we are much less comfortable with the powers and approach that police officers bring to the job. And at least for me personally, that gets wrapped up in my misgivings about America's use of military power. And this episode feels very anti-military. Hardcastle is obviously the villain, or at least, if not the villain, he's definitely the thing that empowers the villain. And really, I would say the Prometheon is an obstacle, but Hardcastle and what he does is the real antagonist of this episode. And he's portrayed as very foolish, very headstrong, as a person who is prepared to blow stuff up without thinking about it first. Like, I get that you're the military and a lot of times your answer to a problem is blow it up. But in this case, General Hardcastle will not entertain any other options. And I just want to point out that this is really interesting to me because it is impossible for me to be pro-military and pro-cop in 2020. They both come under an umbrella of we need to rethink these approaches as far as I'm concerned. But this show from 25 years ago is prepared to split that hair. And I just find that interesting and fascinating. I don't know that I have like a big bow to wrap on that, but I wanted to bring it up and see how you felt about it, Caleb.
No, I think you're certainly onto something. And again, I do like that you're pointing out that the real villain here isn't a thing. And it's not, I would even say it's almost, I mean, obviously Hardcastle is sort of the manifestation of this, but the thing that causes the problem is ignorance and xenophobia. Essentially, Superman's like, hey, I'm here to save the day. I'm here to help solve this problem. And instead of hearing him out, he says, I don't need that guy. We'll just blow him up because that's how we always do stuff. And without and then he ignores the recommendation from the expert scientist who says, hold on, let's actually look at this before we take action. He's like, well, screw you, and just blows it up, right? So it's really a combination of fear and arrogance and ignorance, all three of those kind of in one, that this character reacts, and that those three things, conveyed through this character is what really creates the problem. Because even before the asteroid, we find out about the Prometheon, the asteroid's there, and it's not really going to do anyone any harm because it doesn't appear to be crashing on Earth. They have time.
It is coming to Metropolis. It is going to fall on Metropolis.
But they have time. Yeah. But it's not imminent. They have time to think through it. And his response is, we're just going to blow it up. So just to clarify there, that meteor was going to hit, but it was the knee-jerk reaction of let's just blow it up versus let's listen to experts, or let's rely on the power of this other being who is quote unquote not one of us, but also is known for solving problems like this. That's the thing I want to point out there with what you bring up before Superman even shows up, when it's just Hamilton and Hardcastle. Hardcastle is prepared to put the lives of his men in danger for no reason other than his xenophobia for Superman. Right.
That's the only reason.
And the ego, I think, is a big part of it too. But the ego is a way to cover the fear.
Absolutely. That's all wrapped up in there. I agree with you. But the point is, for me, he's willing to let these men go to their possible deaths. And yes, it's their duty and their job and they volunteered and all that good stuff. I appreciate that. But if you are the general of men, you are a leader of men and women, and you have an option that puts one person's life in danger and a person who is under a lot less danger than the rest of your squad, why are you so willing to throw these people's lives away? And it's because he's not a good person. And he is our emblem, as you say, he is emblematic of American military in this episode. It's fascinating. I noticed it because they split a hair that I'm not prepared to do 25 years later, and I understand why. While I think policing had a lot of problems in the 90s, they did not have the level of military-style hardware that they do now. So I get it, but on top of this is a pretty anti-military episode of Superman. What?
Right. And to circle back on what you were talking about, just going back to the question you posed about this initially, I think it's an interesting hair to split. I think it's worth splitting. I don't think... I think in 2020, those things seemed much more closely intertwined than they did 25 years ago. I do think they're different, but I think they're sort of both systemic from the same problem. So you almost have to, right now, to address the larger problem, you have to talk about both of those things. Whereas in the 90s, I don't think that they had quite... had to confront the kind of some of the issues related to policing, which is why you see, hey, it's pro-cop. We've got Dan Turpin. You know, we're really pro-police, but also anti-military. I do think they are two separate things, but they are very closely intertwined, and we can see that much more in 2020 than we could in the 90s.
Yes, 100%. So fascinating. What do you guys think? You listeners at home, what do you think? Come back with us. Talk to us about that. I find it fascinating. Now, I think that probably covers basically everything we have to say about the Prometheon. As much as I love this episode, at the same time, it does what it means to do expertly, but what it means to do has a lot going on, but it's, we've unpacked it. And I think the alternate media recommendations that both you and I came up with for this episode, Caleb, are fascinating. And I'd like you to start first. By all means, if people are into the Prometheon, what else should they be watching, reading, or experiencing?
Well, we've got to stick with kaiju, right? We've already talked about this a lot, and we've, of course, mentioned Godzilla being the classic kaiju. So I went with my favorite Godzilla movie of recent memory, which is not actually an American Godzilla movie. I'm referring to Shin Godzilla from 2016. And I really like this movie for a few different reasons. But for those of you listeners who aren't as familiar with the Godzilla lore, yes, there is a whole Godzilla lore, mythology, not going to get into that. Shin Godzilla essentially, quote unquote, reboots the whole premise of Godzilla in, 2016 in a more modern context. And it's really fascinating because the whole thing about kaiju that I think Josh was already alluded to is it's a manifestation of real world fears. And the original Godzilla was a manifestation of the fear of the nuclear bomb, which is why you see in the very original film, Godzilla is there to terrorize and destroy Japan. And then as Japan starts to slowly embrace nuclear power as a viable option, Godzilla then, while dangerous, is working for the government. He is pro-human and pretty quickly. So what Shin Godzilla does is recontextualizes this, and the way they do it's really fascinating. Godzilla in this movie is more of a manifestation of natural disasters, which, if you recall, there was a giant tsunami that set off a nuclear power plant, and I think it was 2011. And this movie is reckoning with that. And also, it's really reckoning with bureaucracy and how it prevents people from solving the problems. And also, how it oftentimes interferes with the military, leading to much larger consequences outside of just Godzilla's attacking. So I think it sort of does what Godzilla did in the 50s in 2016. And I love it. It's great. What's funny is Godzilla's, he's the source of the problem, but really more of the movie is people arguing, bureaucracy, corruption in politics, a lot of nationalism. There's a lot of things going on there. I really like it. Shin Godzilla. It's brilliant. Check it out. But Joshua, this has me very excited to hear your recommendations. So what do you recommend listeners watch, read, or play following the Prometheon?
So I actually almost went with the 2014 American reboot of Godzilla because I think a lot of what's going on in this episode also goes on in that movie. But That movie, I liked it. It's good, but it's not great. So instead, I'm going to talk about a kaiju movie that is legitimately great and goes much harder on the anti-military or rethink your military approach themes. And that is 2017's Kong: Skull Island. This film is amazing. The casting is amazing. The acting is amazing. It wears its message on its sleeve. The American military response not only causes the problem, it exacerbates the problem, it fails utterly to end the problem, and because it's a period film, the American military response to Skull Island starts with Vietnam, which we've already, I think, largely accepted as kind of a giant military mistake in our country's history, right? We should absolutely be looking after the veterans of that war, but that war was a mistake. It shouldn't have happened. And we watch these people on this show take that failed war to Skull Island and create a new failed war on Skull Island that is not only failing to deal with the threat, but actually exacerbates the global problem. Love it. Highly recommended Kong Skull Island. If you haven't seen it, see it. If you have seen it, see it again.
100% that recommendation, Joshua. I actually think Kong Skull Island is one of the underrated great blockbusters of the 2010s. Seriously, check it out. And by the way, I'm not trying to sell it a little harder, but it also stars Tom Hiddleston, Samuel L. Jackson, John Goodman, Brie Larson. It's got John C. Reilly in there. It's got a great cast. There's no reason you should not immediately go check out this film. And on top of all the commentary that Joshua mentioned, it's just a great freaking popcorn movie. It's lots of fun. Check it out.
My favorite popcorn movies are the ones that also have big thoughts going on. Like, do
100%.
Both of those things. That's what I love. That's really what brings me to superhero comics most of the time. So I can close that circuit with Kong. That about wraps it up for this animated discussion. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to join in, come find us on Twitter. Caleb is at CMastersTalk and I'm at Joshua Unruh. And the hashtag is animated discussion. Caleb, where else can people find you?
Well, Joshua, they can find me at the Cinematropolis. I'm the editor-in-chief and contributor at the website. The Cinematropolis is a website that specializes in in-depth film critique and analysis. We also have a podcast, The Cinematic Schematic. We publish these in-depth essays on all types of films, and you can find all of those and the podcast at thecinematropolis.com.
Remember that an animated discussion is a Pulp Diction Productions program and is 100% supported by listeners like you. To find out how you can keep this and our other shows in production, please check out patreon.com/pulpdiction productions. Show your support by pledging at Patreon or by leaving a great review on Apple Podcasts to make it easier for more people to find us and join in the discussion.
And of course, the links to Patreon, Apple Podcasts, our recommendations, and Twitter are all very easy to find in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us for this animated discussion. We'll be back next time to discuss the new Batman Adventures episode, Torch Song.
Until next time, look! Up in the sky! It's a bird! It's a plane! It's an animated discussion!